that that's possible. And on the one hand, this is just my analysis, might not be correct, but you've got basically the transatlantic Tories, like Cameron, essentially, though there's worse figures than Cameron, and they want to do the US bidding in Europe, and so the US wants them to stay in, and so they're in. And then you've got what I call the let's make the UK the Hong Kong of the North Tories. And I wonder, like, underpinning that, okay, the transatlantic Tories, you kind of know that, but you look at the associations, the boards that they're on, blah, blah, then in some ways not very interesting. The other ones I don't know so much about. My suspicion is that they're connected to banks that trade predominantly with the rest of the world, not with European Union, and they don't want regulatory shackles from the European Union.
And they also aren't really dependent on the continental economy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about how the UK economy worked, I've only been living here for maybe 6 years, so it took me a while to figure out, well, how do they sustain the British economy? It seems like it doesn't seem to make a lot of intuitive sense. People seem to be sending lots of stuff here. We're not sending much back. The line is financial services. Well, we provide financial services. But basically, you know, if you really examine it, that seems to come down to like people here are just so good with paperwork that other people are dazzled and send us their car and steals and things like that.
And we've got 80% debt to GDP ratio in the UK.
Yeah, it's a housing bubble. It's essentially a huge amount of speculation built on a housing bubble, and the housing bubble is
the housing bubble though is partly driven by immigration.
That's where I was going with this.
Okay.
Yeah. But not immigration from the EU.
Yeah.
That's what the key
well,
thing.
Well, both, right?
Yeah, but it's mainly immigration from pretty much anywhere else.
Yeah. Why is that? Because they have more money than non-EU migrants.
Yeah. I think basically, so I was trying to figure that out.
This area is amazing around here, with all the princes buying up expensive buildings.
Right, and you got to ask yourself, why do anybody who's like makes $1 billion in Bahrain or Hong Kong or Ecuador, probably Ecuador, has to have a flat in London? Why? The climate stinks. I mean, what's so great about London? I mean, it's pretty buildings, but there's a lot of places like
Russian oligarchs around Mayfair, for example.
Yeah, no, I live in Notting Hill. Half of it's lost, half of it's still cool, but half of it's just like, nobody even lives there. It's just like row on row of like Russian oligarch or Saudi princes and beautiful cars and no people. But the reason why seems to be, if you ask people, they say, well, first of all, there's political stability, and second of all, you have this very amenable, creative population who can give you anything you want. So I kind of realized, well, actually, if you think about it politically, it's the historical defeat of the English working classes is England's great export product at this point. Because nothing's going to happen to you here. There's not going to be a riot. Not the one that's going to affect those people. There's not going to be any civil unrest. And you have these like people who really know how to be butlers to take care of your every whim. So that's what
you've got strong libel laws and courts that are only basically accessible to rich people.
Oh yeah, I mean it's like the greatest country in the world to be rich. So you suck in all this money, which feeds the housing bubble. And I think that's one reason why there's this sort of anti-immigrant hatred. It's just displaced. If you're a working class person, you know that the thing that's keeping cheap consumer electronics or running shoes or things like that coming in that you can afford is exactly the dominance of a bunch of people who hate you and are marketing their hatred for you and your historical defeat and subservience to rich people all over the world. So of course they resent it, but they can't resent the people who actually are causing the problem, so they displace it from Bahraini princes to Pakistani cab drivers to actual poor immigrants. So in a way, there's something there that's true, but it's displaced onto the people who aren't really causing the problem.
What do you think the big factions are here in the UK? Well, can I ask you another question? So there's a question about what's good for England, on average, for all the people. Brexit, no Brexit. What's good for EU? Then you can even take it down what's good for Germany versus France. France historically has wanted to enmesh Germany in other bigger structures
Right.
to balance it out after the Second World War. And then, but if you look from, say, an African perspective, you're in Kenya, you're the Kenyan government. What do you want? UK in or UK out?
That's a really interesting question.
I don't think anyone's
actually
asking
know.
this.
Yeah, I would imagine that if you're Commonwealth, you would be happy with the UK leaving. It would mean you once again walk on the favourable line in the airport. You know? A lot of people told me that.
When I came into this godforsaken country before I couldn't get out
Yeah.
5.5 years ago, yeah, I'm Australian. There's no favourable line. You're just
Yeah.
treated like any other rubbish.
Yeah, exactly, and that wasn't true 10, 20 years ago. You know, so we go back to that again. So
David, we just have, for technical reasons, we have to break for just a few minutes.
okay.
This is the Brexit Club with Julian Assange, broadcasting live from inside the Ecuadorian embassy police siege on the day of the vote count. The vote is almost just about to close. You can ask us questions on Twitter, ask with #AskBrexitClub. We'll read out a bunch of those. We'll be back with more from Professor David Graeber from the LSE, MIA, Varoufakis, and a whole lot more. Back soon. Okay. Contacts in the city, and they were giving their
Yeah, I haven't
perspective.
talked to him as much recently as I want, but they didn't seem to think it would make much difference one way or the other. The prevailing feeling seemed to be the general housing bubble crash and resultant possible world crash is going to happen one way or another. It'll like affect it a couple points one way, but really won't do much.
Yeah, so regardless of Brexit,
Yeah.
Your hedge fund contacts say that there's...
The current economic model is utterly unsustainable, and it will come crashing to the ground at some point over the next 4 years.
Regardless of...
Yeah.
Yeah, regardless of Brexit. So that's, quite interesting.
Yeah.
Hello?
Pablo, can you hear me? This is Julian.
Hey,
Assange.
Julia. Having some trouble with the sound.
We're
Now I can
fine
hear.
now. I'm just going to introduce you. Well, actually, Pablo, I don't know how to pronounce your surname. Can you Bustindui, is that correct?
Bustindui, almost.
Bustindui.
That's
This
easy.
is Pablo Bustindui. He is the foreign policy spokesperson for Podemos, the large political party in Spain, which is heading into an election imminently. Pablo, what is Podemos's position on Brexit?
Well, we have said during these past weeks that actually we have called for a remain, not with any illusions, not making any illusions about the current state of the European Union, but believing that our vote, our Brexit right now, will be favorable for a greater condition of process, the democratic, let's say, coalition, rather than austerity. So we want to stay in Europe, change it. We're hoping to win the election, hopefully accumulate to be able to fight the oligarchs ruling us.
Pablo, we're having a bit of problem with your audio. Can I just put you on hold?
Yes,
Why
Sounded
the
interesting.
technicians try to fix it? David,
Yeah,
you're originally from the
The
United
States,
States.
yeah.
Have you spoken to your US friends about
some of them, yeah.
what's their view?
I don't think any of them take it really seriously. They don't think it's happening. Insofar as they do, it's this kind of a world-weary, why is it that every single time there's a vote, the only choice we have is essentially between the fascists and the neoliberals? You know, it's a little like Trump and Hillary, you know, I mean, it's
Yeah.
the same thing. That's the reason you kind of got to hold your nose and vote for the neoliberals, even though you hate them. And it's just like, but the thing you really hate is the system that ensures it over and over again. That's the only thing that when popular will is called on, that's it. That's the only choice you're ever allowed to make.
Do you have a view about how the 80% of GDP debt in the UK, 100% in France, 120% in Spain, is feeding into the view about what the European Union is? Because it is,
Yeah, I
there
mean,
is a European, well, the European Central Bank and a bailout structure, a sort of ad hoc actually bailout structure that was arranged.
yeah, I mean, well, where to start? The entire project of the EU is incredibly flawed because it's something, you know, you can't have a country like Germany, which is essentially an export-based economy, without having other countries that are import-based economies. So, and you can't have a system like that without some method of fiscal transfer to balance between the two, or huge debts will accumulate at the margins. Everybody knows that. It's simple math, you know. In America,
Well, America had similar problem, right?
yeah, they just
And then-
transfer the cash, you know. So New York or Massachusetts or California basically funds countries like states like Louisiana, which would be countries in the EU, or North Dakota.
Why is that done at a political level? Is that to stop political opposition in those states, or is it done for economic reasons that New York exporters and bankers want to be able
No,
to have
it's
the
the only
industry?
way to keep the whole system running. I mean, otherwise it would. And the fascinating thing in America is that nobody even notices. It's not an issue. Nobody cares. In fact, it's an issue in reverse. All the people who are the beneficiaries of this flow of, you know, reflow of money from the richer states to the poorer ones are the ones who claim to hate the federal government and, you know, demand their independence. So oddly enough, the political effects are the opposite than in places like, you know, the relation of Germany and Greece, where there is no transfer over again, but everybody resents the Greeks anyway.
Well, maybe there's reason.
Yeah.
I think we might have Pablo back. Pablo, foreign policy spokesperson for Podemos, which is just about to go into an election in Spain. Pablo?
Hello, Jude. Can you hear me now?
This time,
We
go.
can hear you. You're occasionally breaking up, but just keep speaking and we'll see what it's like.
Okay, we'll try this time, see if it works. I was saying the position has been basically to call for a Remain vote, not making us any illusions about the current state of the European Union, the flaws of its institutional design, but from a political perspective. We think that a Brexit right now will not be favorable to the accumulation of forces in order to build that coalition against austerity, which is basically a political battle. So our bet is for Jeremy Corbyn in the next election, the UK to join the side of those unions around Europe that are gathering a common fight against austerity and against the pitiful state of the European Union today, which is facing an economic, political, and a moral.
Pablo, are you there?
We had
Yes,
you for a
yeah.
while.
Can I ask you to be quite concise because you occasionally break up, so we
Yeah.
hopefully get a good chunk.
We got the first 2/3.
We got your statement just then. From a with a geostrategic point of view from within Europe, does Spain, by that I mean the Spanish state or the Spanish establishment, maybe the Spanish people, want to balance out or water down the strength of Germany within Europe by including as many other countries as possible, in particular, in this case, the UK. Because some French strategists do take that view, that Germany needs to be shackled to the European Union as a project to contain it, and it can't be the overwhelmingly dominant member when the entire membership is added together. Clearly, as a single country, it's 1.5 times the GDP of the UK, so it is economically dominant. But does the Spanish establishment feel that it needs the UK to balance Germany?
Well, I would say it's paradoxical, because actually a Brexit would increase the proportional weight of Spain with the European Union. You know, Spain has traditionally been a very pro-European country, but according to a recent survey, Spain is the country where Euroscepticism has grown more in the whole Union. So basically, it's a confrontation of power, right? If you are putting it, Germany, Europe has united for the periphery. And now, the battle that we are facing is one in which our goal is to gather enough for an ambitious project of democratization of the EU.
Sorry, Pablo, you're cutting out a bit there. Can I ask, in relation to the Eurozone, Spain is part of the Eurozone, the UK is not part of the Eurozone. Isn't it really, as David was just saying before, you've got Germany, an export economy driven by exports with the same currency as other countries like Spain and Greece, Italy, on its periphery. It's inevitable under that circumstance that those other countries will get into incredible debts. And unless there's a way of continually cancelling those debts or taxing the Germans and then creating grants out of that tax base, that there will be inevitable intense privatization to pay for those debts and economic impoverishment of countries in the Eurozone. What is Podemos going to... Does Podemos have a simple idea about what to do about that very basic problem with the Eurozone?
Yeah, I think there is a certain fetishism about the Eurozone. The problem that we have is not simply the architecture of the Eurozone. It's an economic structure. In Europe, we have the financial center of Germany, export-oriented economy. Then we have the eastern countries, which provide a very cheap labor. And then we have the periphery in the south. And our role is to be consumers in those financial countries. And then to be basically a resource. So in order to get autonomy and independence, we need to reindustrialize our country. It's a change of a model that we need. And that is hard tougher than a simple competition between countries or that simple problem about the Eurozone. We need public investment to reindustrialize countries of the South.
David, do you have...
Yeah, well, I mean, that is what's really at stake here. The financialized model is only going to last so long. And you know, what we'd had was an American model, was essentially imperial. They call it financial, but it's essentially a shakedown system. And people like Michael Hudson have demonstrated this at great length, that essentially all the countries under military protection of the US are indirectly providing tribute to them by buying US Treasury bonds and so forth. Well, so you have financialized economies are essentially military economies. And you have Europe, which is doing this industrial-driven, export-oriented alternative to it. UK was caught in between. You know, it's always been the negotiating point as the former imperial power. In a way, you could say that as the choice. But both models are just completely non-viable at this point, and they both have to be completely renegotiated. So in a way, the question is which side is the UK going to slant to? Where is its natural place to throw itself in with to get beyond the current dead model of either? It seems to make sense to do it in Europe because it faces similar problems. It's clear there is going to be a financial crash. It needs to and people in the Labour Party, at least, are actually talking about this now, like how to recreate the British economy around high-tech industries and move away from this endless dependence on essentially housing bubbles, but what they call finance.
Can I just interrupt you, David? The polls are going to close in 5 minutes' time. We have some feedback from Twitter. You can tweet Ask Brexit Club. And quite a lot of interest. Okay, so they say nice things about the program. I'm not going to read that out, but that's nice. Wouldn't it be better if England exists because of the IMF and big banks? I'm not sure what that means exactly.
I think we'd still be here without them.
An interesting question, which I did ask you earlier.
What was that?
What does Brexit mean for people outside of Europe, if anything? Pablo, do you have a view on that? Because if, I've lived in Africa, I'm an Australian culturally. The European Union, economically, insofar as it, in its most cohesive form, is an economic bloc engaging in economic negotiations with the rest of the world. It's not always a positive actor in the rest of the world. In its economic negotiations, for example, pursuing with the United States, of course, who's pushing the most aggressively, TTIP. The UK has been also a solid element within the European Union pushing TTIP. What do you think, from a Podemos perspective, about the TTIP project and also how the European Union acts with the rest of the world? Europe historically has been an imperial power. Is it now slowly becoming at least an economic imperial power again?
Well, TTIP is obviously a constitutional treaty. It's not a trade treaty. We are at an unstable geopolitical moment. I think that the accumulation of financial power in Europe has not declined. I think that what you were saying, that the instruments for policy or vision through national corporations and so forth, the impact is bigger than ever. And I think that what's at stake is a political struggle on what the material execution of that union is going to be in the next decade or so. So defeating TTIP is a key stage in that battle, and I think that a Brexit will not necessarily alter that role of the European Union within the world economy, especially in its next.
Pablo, you've cut out again, so thank you very much. Good luck with your campaign. David, you wrote a whole book on this issue of debt and how it comes into being. Mm-hmm. Can you, because I perceive that free movement of labour and free movement of capital is largely driving the dynamics that have now led to Brexit, the different factions. There's also some transatlantic desires in relation to keeping the UK in the EU to benefit transatlanticism. Right. But I want to take a regional approach. Debt is very old. The concept of debt is extremely old. You owe your friend a favour. Can you just very briefly summarise, if we can, we have a very abstract process here. Okay. We have the European Union, we have a votes on top and so on. If we go way back down to this, how debt evolved in human societies.
Well, debt comes before money, if you want to think of money as cash. We have this idea that first there was barter, and then, that becomes inconvenient, so people take something, say gold, we'll make that money. And then gradually you get these credit, and it's sort of a natural line of evolution until you get to securitized derivatives and whatnot. Actually, history is exactly the opposite. Credit comes first. The idea of I owe you one is a very, very old notion. Taking an object to like indicate exactly how many ones I owe you is not so old. And it takes an enormous amount of violence, actually, before you can take what are essentially moral relations of obligation between people and turn them into something which is totally non-negotiable and enforceable in an impersonal fashion.
Right, so if you take a housing loan and you tend to pay it back, but then your mother's sick,
Exactly.
you need to pay for a cancer treatment.
They don't care.
So you start not paying the loan, or not as much of it. What compels you to do it? It's the application of violence by the police, ultimately.
Exactly, although it becomes moralized. And this is the fascinating thing, because if you look at it, you could say debt is a corruption of a promise. It's a promise sort of corrupted by some combination of mathematics and violence. Nothing wrong with math, but when it sort of meets violence, terrible things tend to happen. But it still remains a promise when it's between equals. So if there are people that you really see as a full moral person like unto yourself, it's still just a promise. If I promise to meet you at 5 and my mother dies, you're not going to expect me to do it. And you're not going to just transfer that obligation to someone else, right? So a debt is still like that between equals.
It's a lasting promise.
Yeah. So when American Insurance Group, needs a couple $1 billion, they can go say, look, I know we made these deals, but such things changed, and people will say, all right, we'll figure out some way to cook the books and let you off the hook for it. But if a mortgage holder does, well, a whole nother deal. So it's debts between the rich and the poor, between the powerful and the powerless, that take on this absolute
at the
character.
same level of class, it's more,
you're
it's
still
more elastic.
friends. Yeah. So if I'm some working class guy and my brother's in trouble, I'll say, hey, I'll give you a loan of $1,000, or I don't really expect him to pay me back. Sometimes it's just a gift. Sometimes he'll give me back what he can. Everything's negotiable between friends. And I call this the communism of the rich. The rich people really do take each other's abilities and needs into consideration. I mean, they'll play these games, Goldman Sachs versus Bear Stearns versus, but when their common interests are really threatened, they pull together, they bail each other out, which is what we saw in 2008. And that's what's really become visible in the case of Germany and Greece, that Germany is essentially saying, we don't see you as a country equivalent to ourselves. If we did, we would figure out a way to let you off the hook, just like we let all those banks who lent you the money irresponsibly, off the hook. Or, and it's even individuals. Because if you look at what happened in Greece, the guys who took these corrupt loans, the guy who's the head of the Greek central bank when they were being taken out, those guys are like in the EU now. I mean, they're fine.
David, the polls have just closed for Brexit. You're watching Brexit Club, brexitclub.eu. You can go to that website, brexitclub.eu. That's where we're live streaming from the heart of the Ecuadorian embassy here in London, which is still under police siege, where I've been detained for 5.5 years without charge.
Don't see any cops
we have, I think we have, is Ben Griffin there? No, he's, Ben Griffin.
Hello.
G'day,
Right.
Ben.
David,
Very
nice to meet you. You all right, Jay?
Ben Griffin is a former SAS soldier. You're basically working class origin in this country.
Yep, that's correct, yeah.
And you're now running part of Veterans for Peace UK.
Yep.
So part of the peace movement here. Can you give your perspective? Well, first of all, for you, in or out?
I'm firmly out, voted today, voted to get out.
And which way do you think the poll's going to go?
I think it's going to be a close call.
And what?
I usually,
Yeah, sure.
whenever I sort of vote in anything or pick a football team, I usually lose. So I'm imagining the British public will vote to stay in. What's interesting for me about the debate around the EU and our membership from a security or a foreign policy point of view is to look at this idea that the EU has brought us peace somehow. It's one of the main foreign policy sort of ideas that have been pushed for people to stay in.
And what do you reckon? It's NATO, or that it hasn't brought great
Well,
It hasn't brought Syria peace.
Well, also, even if we look a bit closer to home, since Britain joined the EU in the early 70s, British forces have been involved in conflict continuously. So Northern Ireland throughout the 70s, the Falklands War, the Gulf War, Bosnia, Kosovo, Sierra Leone, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, back in Iraq now, got troops in Syria. So this idea that it's brought peace to the people of Britain is false, I would say, and the idea that it's brought peace outside of Europe is definitely false.
Well, it definitely hasn't stood down British soldiers.
No, not at all. I also think it's interesting to look at what won't change if we vote to leave.
Right, I think that doesn't make any difference. I think it's a real, very interesting question.
Yeah, so Britain will still be part of NATO. Britain will still have nuclear weapons. Britain will still have American bases on our soil. So looking at that immediate term, as in what will Britain look like tomorrow, not very much different. I think one of the possibilities, and it's probably quite a far-fetched possibility, is the possible implications of Britain, the United Kingdom breaking up as a result of Brexit. And that could be interesting. So if, for example, the Scots then push for another referendum,
Which they will.
they gain independence, what does that mean for Britain's nuclear weapons system, bearing in mind that it's based in Scotland?
Yeah.
What does that mean for our membership of NATO? And that is an interesting question. It's hard to predict how that would pan out, but I think it could have some positive implications.
It seems obvious to me that the Scottish National Party, which is the dominant party now in Scotland and runs the state government, that it seems that its interests are surely to push for Brexit because that will further incentivise the population to vote for independence. But actually, publicly, it's saying, no, we need to be part of the EU. Because I think, I think that it's a bit too tricky, right? It's a bit, because afterwards they say we want to join the EU. So it's...
Well, it's actually, they're sort of like playing a double
Well,
bluff.
they can't say they're for it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So for them to demand a referendum because we've left the EU, they need to be campaigning for the EU.
Right.
Yeah. It's a tricky game they're playing, and whether that's going to come off them. Another interesting aspect of the whole thing is the relationship between the north and the south of Ireland, if we were to have a Brexit, where post the Good Friday Agreement there has been a lot of cross-border trade. The two countries are completely reliant on each other.
Sure.
Lots of people travel across that border every day to shop and to work. And how would that play out? And that might actually be a positive thing for Ireland. It might actually draw the Protestant and Unionist communities closer to the island of Ireland, if there was that Scottish independence vote.
Right. There's talk here in one of these papers. We have the Irish Times somewhere. I think it's probably in that international papers.
Over here. Yeah, we have, yeah.
And there's, I think on the overleaf,
Yeah.
there's two columns.
Bit further in.
Not Paddy McGuinness. Who's the other McGuinness?
And we're looking at here.
All right, just pass it over, Ben.
Yeah, there you go.
But anyway, there's a column in the Irish Times saying that, well, let's go back a bit. So there were claims that conflict would start back up again in Northern Ireland, and the peace process would falter if there was a Brexit. It's not immediately obvious why that should be true, but anyway, that's the position being pushed. And so the reaction to that is that, well, this is outrageous to say that this peace process, which a lot of people became involved in and which is fairly settled now, is that brittle, that this would make much of a difference.
Yeah.
What's your take on the different factions? Because you've got the Conservatives here, and it's really interesting that you have the dominant Conservative Party that's in power with David Cameron and his mates, and split over the issue, tremendously split over the issue. Why are these Conservatives doing something that's clearly an electoral disaster to have that disunity? What faction are the Remain people in versus the Leave people? It doesn't seem like it's really about electoral politics,
Yeah.
because there was no need to do it.
Well, I don't think we should look at this as if this has been a rational, well thought through plan. You know, it's almost like it's been forced upon the Conservative Party. I think we forget how close the general election was last year, and that Cameron had to promise that referendum. He had to promise that referendum to keep his own Tory MPs within the party. He was worried about defections to UKIP. He was also worried about losing votes to UKIP. And so Cameron was pushed into this position. And what I find interesting looking at some of the mainstream politicians is actually how unexpected their positions on this are. So I would have assumed that Cameron, a Thatcherite Tory, would be for out. Jeremy Corbyn, leader of the Labour Party, for years was out. And I think that is interesting to see. And what is it? What is it that's behind all this? What is motivating them to forcefully campaign for something that I'm not sure if they actually believe in?
Well, I saw a talk by William Hague, who's the immediately former foreign minister, still a very big person in British Parliament. I think he's leader of the Conservatives in the British Parliament. He was the guy in charge of instructing the Foreign Office and the British police to invade this embassy in violation of international law. They had guys coming down on ropes outside this building, and still very intense surveillance even now. But we found a cable about Hague. This is actually my favourite cable about the UK, actually. In here, my audience will forgive me that I've read this several times. But I think it, to my mind, sums up why what you would think would be nationalist rule Britannia conservatives want to keep the UK in the EU. And that's essentially that they are transatlanticists. And that has been the US position for a long time. And the UK is very much inside the Five Eyes Alliance, Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, and feels that it is, it feels that it is in many ways part of the American empire and helps manage it. And keeping a lid on the development of a European army is part of that. And vetoing, because it has a foreign policy veto within the European Union, it can veto EU foreign policy. So that cable, Hague, goes into the US ambassador here in London, and the ambassador writes a report back, which we got hold of, and this is it. Hague said he, David Cameron, and George Osborne, that's the treasurer, were, quote, children of Thatcher, unquote, and staunch Atlanticists. For his part, said Hague, he has a sister who is American, spends his own vacations in America, and like many similar to him, considers America the, quote, other country to turn to. Asking his senior advisor her views, she said, America is the essential country. Hague said, whoever enters 10 Downing Street as Prime Minister soon learns of the essential nature of the relationship with America. He added, quote, we want a pro-American regime. We need it. The world needs it. I mean, it's like Chomsky's writing a satirical play, but this is actually from the US ambassador back to Washington, D.C., reporting about what William Hague, this big figure in the Conservative Party, and David Cameron, and the Treasurer, George Osborne, believe.
It's interesting because Hague was elected the leader of the Tory party after the 1997 defeat of John Major. And he was definitely elected by some very right-wing element of the Tory party. He would have been a Eurosceptic. And maybe it's this idea that actually political principle doesn't survive contact with real power. And that once he'd got close to that power as the leader of the opposition, his Euroscepticism fell away.
Whoever enters 10 Downing Street soon learns of the essential nature of the relationship. I did see a video of Hague in 2009 speaking to Parliament. And at that time, Tony Blair was running for Juncker's job. Yeah? Juncker is now the president of the of the Commission, and Tony Blair wanted this position, and the Brown government was in power, and the Conservatives were horrified with this idea that Blair the devil would be there in charge of the EU, putting his fangs into the UK, even though they might be in power. So Hague was very aggressively opposing the notion that the EU should have that power, and the EU more generally.
I like this possible concept that Cameron and Hague can actually, part of their Euroscepticism is actually to remain in as spoilers.
Right, that they actually want
right.
to sink the EU. So if we leave, we can't really fuck them up.
Right.
And a Brexit could have possible implications between the relationship between Europe and Russia. You know, Germany might be more open to the idea of a relationship.
Well, there's more
with
economic
Russia
interest for a relationship between Germany
without
and
Britain.
Russia.
Yeah.
Although maybe it could go the other way. I mean, there's a lot of Russians in London, a lot of wealthy Russians in London around Mayfair. David and I were just earlier
the
talking
Russian
about.
money is kind of pulled out.
Yeah, now. you just have the anti-Putin sections.
Yeah.
I see we have
Who's that? Oh, I know him.
Christophe Marchand.
Okay, that's what I know.
He's a European, mostly European, a little bit of international law, from Brussels. He's one of the lawyers in my case. But I thought it'd be interesting to hear from Christophe. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me, Christophe?
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to hear from Christophe, what does it mean for European law if the UK leaves? For people within the UK and perhaps more broadly.
Well, you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. So I think has been that the UK is already like in the EU law. So it means that all EU law has become new. So all those laws, I think, will remain.
Sorry, Christophe, you're breaking up a bit. Can we come back to you a little bit later?
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay. Ben, it seems to me that the EU as an institution is so weak that it was not able to promote its genuine interests in relation to Syria and Libya. Now, you might want to talk about that there's different sections of different entities in the EU and different factions and so on. But it's obvious to anyone who was watching the situation that Hillary Clinton's push, together with some elements of France predominantly, to move into Libya and similarly with Syria, would produce a refugee disaster. It's obvious that that was going to happen to anyone who was watching at the time. And that is not in the broad interests of the EU population. But it happened anyway.
Yeah, and I think, you know, maybe Britain had a role to play in that. You might know more about the behind-the-scenes conversations, maybe from what you've seen in leaks.
Well, the former foreign minister of France under Sarkozy, he said that he was approached by the UK in 2009 about let's attack Libya. So at least for the Libyan case, yeah. But, you know, the EU foreign policy institution is so weak that it was not able to discipline member states like the UK or France, a little bit Italy, from engaging in crazed adventures that put all the southern flank of the EU at risk from mass migration, from terrorist attacks, etc.
Yeah, I think what we can see there is the divided loyalties within the EU that we've already talked about, the possibility of Britain as a spoiler within that within that bloc. But also, you know, we can't forget that actually NATO pretty much spans over the entire EU
Yeah.
anyway,
Right.
which is a completely different institution.
Right, and Libya was a NATO operation.
Was a NATO
Right.
operation.
Syria's not. Yeah.
Syria is not. So these things are complex, and you know, there's this other idea that actually Europe would be a lot better off, would be able to define itself better, would be able to organise itself better without the influence of Britain within it. You know, so looking at it from a pan-European perspective, you know, rather than a sort of like little Englander perspective, it might actually be better for Europe, and in the long run, better for Britain, if we were to leave and let Europe to sort of truly embrace this project, maybe that they've been wanting to embrace for a long time, that ourselves and, you know, some of the Eastern European countries have been putting the brakes on.
We might have Christophe back. Christophe Machan, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, that sounds better.
Okay, try again.
So I would say that it's such a long time that the
No, you're breaking up again, Christophe. Right. But it's quite embarrassing, really. But, you know, it's hard with GCHQ everywhere around the embassy. You were speaking about the UK being a spoiler within the EU. I watched a talk recently by Lord Owen on the defence implications of Brexit. And he's a pro-Brexit person.
Right.
But quite interesting. His view, and actually similar to Haig's view, is that that the EU is, my God, it seems like it might be starting its own army, and there is one, the EAA, the European something agency, European. I can't remember. Sorry, EEA, European External. No, European EAA, European
Enforcement Agency.
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
External
Some
Affairs.
army.
Yeah.
Sorry, External Affairs Agency. EAA.
Right, okay. Sounds very innocuous.
Sounds innocuous, but it's
Yeah.
actually army. But has only $1 billion a year. in
1
budget.
billion.
1
Right.
billion, which from
It's like one airplane.
which for almost any European country is completely insignificant.
Yeah.
And the United States, which has something like $500 billion a year military budget, is utterly
Way over that,
insignificant.
yeah.
But this, the fear from people like Owen is that one day this will come to rival NATO. One day. And that the people like Owen say, therefore, we should get the hell out of the thing before Europe becomes what's basically in the front of this newspaper from here. I'll just show you.
Okay.
The local area paper.
Oh, is it?
It's interesting because obviously the big newspapers there, everyone can read those, but not many people know about this one. The EU is an unelected three-tier dictatorship on the Soviet model with a sham parliament in Brussels. In time, that means slavery for us all. So that is actually a section of the Tories really do believe that Germany is the dominant force in Europe. At 1.5 times the GDP of the UK. It's creating structures and institutions that France believes the way to contain Germany is to put it into a superstate. You know? Rather than having to deal with German nationalism, you dilute Germany down by creating a federal state structure. And to do that properly, you obviously have to have some kind of army. And some parts of the French are still not so happy about the US empire, eating into their African empire. And so people like Owen think we've got to get the UK out of this slowly, inevitably developing European continental integration before it has its army, before German influenced regulation that's good for German industry but it's bad for British industry starts creeping over the UK.
Yeah.
And then you've got people like Haig who kind of have the same analysis, but what they say the result should be, perhaps because they're more transatlantic, is that the UK should stay in the EU to prevent European integration from occurring.
To veto.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they want the same thing, but they've just got different approaches.
That makes better sense. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting, this concept, though, taking it, looking at something different in terms of that actually leaving the EU will mean that our politicians will actually have to stand up to greater scrutiny, in that they won't be able to blame the EU for things that are happening within society. Mm-hmm. And also the British public won't be able to use the EU as an excuse for what's happening by saying, oh, well, if it wasn't for the EU, this wouldn't be happening.
Do you think they'll figure out a way to do it anyway? I don't know.
What, to kind of blame the EU?
Yeah, you can blame the ghost of it. Well, we have to deal with all these EU countries.
Oh, the outcomes of I suppose, what, in the immediate future?
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing that's happened, I've seen directly in relation to me, that this government, Cameron government, has erected this crazed 15 million pounds, $20 million surveillance siege of this embassy and me. It's not about what Ecuador is doing in the UK, it's about me. And when questioned on that, even by people within his own party, he goes, oh, well, it's the EU that forces me into doing it. It's not the US relationship that forces him into doing it. It's the EU and, it's extradition without charge, European arrest warrants that he's forced into doing it. But when the UK was largely behind pushing these things in the first place, and similarly with trying to water down European privacy legislation, some of the most neoliberal laws coming out of the EU have been put there by the UK. So it's create nasty, obnoxious laws. UK pushes for it, gets it into the EU. Then when it comes back onto the UK, it's like, oh, we're forced into it by the EU.
Same thing about the treaty, the treaty alliances or TTIP or things like that. It's just a way of saying you're not responsible for your own policies. Okay,
we have to go to a break now for technical reasons, so we can cut some of this section to upload. You've been watching the Brexit Club. That's brexitclub.eu. We'll be back surveying what the media response is. We have more guests and what the fallout of Brexit's going to be. There's not going to be a vote count for a while. There would have been an exit poll, except the BBC killed it. God knows why. Okay.
I looked into her eyes and I swore I've never written a cliche before, and I'll probably never do so. She was beautiful though. I think it's time for me and you to take over the world.